Welcome everyone to the INC Transportation Committee meeting for May 9th, 2024. We meet every other month to bring a variety of topics that are timely and pertain to our evolving mobility environment to neighborhoods and neighbors throughout the city. Today we've got a packed meeting with 4 topics, starting with Jenn Hillhouse from DOTI, the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure in Denver, talking about the various corridor studies that Denver is leading and what's common about them, what the general idea is. Then we'll go to an update on some pretty major work going on by RTD this summer that will have big changes to how light rail works and as well as other services to try to pick up the slack. Next, we'll go to June Churchill. She's a volunteer registered lobbyist with representing both the Denver Bike Lobby and Greater Denver Transit, advocating at the state level for all the various mobility bills that came through this year. It was a huge session. We kicked off the session at a previous meeting with an update from Denver Streets Partnership on legislation that was expected, and we'll close out the session, which ended yesterday, hearing from June about how things went. And finally, we'll end the night with Amy Ford, the Executive Director of Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, talking about some news about Vision Zero and approaches for making a big impact on reducing traffic deaths and serious injuries. First, we'll start with Jenn Hillhouse and an update on the corridor studies. Welcome.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Joel, and thank you all of INC for having me. You have a packed agenda, very interesting topics, but I will tell you, I think you're going to be most astounded by Amy's wrap up. So really exciting things happening in this space. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. I have a presentation here for you all, and just let me know if you are able to see that.
Looks perfect.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Jenn Hillhouse. I am the Director of Transportation Mobility Planning for DOTI. So you can think of my team as the innovators, right? The think tank. So we stand up the strategies, the vision, as well as our priorities and investment to really reach our goals. I know that many of you, and I think my team had been updating you on Denver Moves Everyone, so you might recognize some of the graphics here. And really all of this work that I'm going to talk to you about tonight stems from that work and really advancing our modal goals. So a lot happening. As Joel mentioned, these are in different phases. So talking to you about our safety and multimodal corridors, you can see all of the lines on the map. And I'll go through each one of these at really high level around where we're at in the process, what our priorities are, some of the advancements that we've had. Know that these are all in different phases. So some are going to have a lot of detail. Others are just honestly getting started. One kind of clarification is some of these projects we are not leading. So we might be partners with DRCOG or with the state, but they're really, really critical corridors. And so we're more than stakeholders. We really are influencing and driving the outcomes here. These are all on our high injury network. They're all high priority transit corridors. So really focused in those priorities where the investment is needed most, the attention is needed most. So you can see the corridor studies that are in planning as well. And so those are the corridors highlighted in blue. And then the design projects, things that we're advancing into construction as York, 17th, 18th, our bus priority package, as well as federal. So the first one up, Broadway, really, really important corridor. You guys, we just celebrated the multi-use path along the corridor and other enhancements for safety. But now the region is starting to look at how we reimagine Broadway. And so the extends here are 25 to Highland, so really extending the work that we've just done. And this is a collaboration. So we know that our goals don't stop at our boundaries, right? We really have to partner with our sister agencies, sister cities to make sure that our regional goals are met. This project kicked off in the fall of 22 and is just coming to commencement with some of the recommendations. This is really looking long-term. So this is a high-level visioning document and really setting the stage for where we need to drive investments into the future. And the final plan is planning to be published or has been published on the 8th, just yesterday. So what we looked at here is long-term vision, as I mentioned, really focusing on that safety and mobility, but also looking at our commercial corridors along the corridor and economic development. But with that, although we are looking at long-term, also under that umbrella, what can we advance in the near term to really showcase how this street can operate in different ways. We're looking at above curb bike facilities throughout, as well as the bus lanes, dedicated bus lanes through Denver and Inglewood. And that was really something to celebrate because we thought that was going to be a harder conversation, but certainly our region is coming along with this. And then looking at that bus frequency of 5 minutes to create that mode shift that we needed along the corridor. So you can see a cross section, the final recommendation that's coming through that work. York Josephine, another really exciting one, and I think one that you'll hear from Amy. So this was another one that we set long-term vision, but we also looked at near-term improvements, and it's moving into construction in July. So we are taking 4 lanes and converting into 3. This is a high injury network, lot of crash picture along the corridor, and moving through residential community. And so really that 3-way conversion is in a segment of the corridor, and then that longer term is what we think about to the north. York used to tie into the highway and no longer does. So it allows us to think through, it tied into I-70. And so allows us to think through that in a different way and really creating a community street out here and really slowing speeds is our goal. Evans is another one, just recently kind of moving through the process, but will, it will wrap up, here soon. But Colorado to Quebec, so another high injury network, we are leading this process and really focusing on safety multimodal, as well as green infrastructure is coming into this is a high priority green infrastructure street. And so how we can green and clean our water before it enters into the system. And so we're in phase 2 of engagement, which will end here this month. And then we're concluding our alternatives analysis. This is also, and you'll see at the end of the presentation, what we call road safety audits that we pull in to really think about those short-term safety improvements that we can do today, like through work order and really making immediate action along the corridor. So here's some of the concepts that are coming through. A lot of access management is the priority here. We have what we call a suicide lane, right? A middle lane that allows for left turns without a lot of organization and understanding of how we operate the street for vehicles specifically. And so how we clean that up through potential medians, but also giving priority to our transit as well as people walking and ADA accessibility. So this one is one that you can get involved in and would be great to have your feedback on. Alameda is the next one. This is being led through Dr. Cog, but certainly I see ourselves almost as like a co-project manager. This is moving through Lakewood and into Aurora. So looking at the entire extent of Alameda. This is a BRT corridor. It's a high injury network. All of these are, but really looking at how do we connect? How do we provide that safety, improve our transit, and the vibrancy? That's the economic development piece. So, thinking about how we create the vision, and you see some themes here, but also that short term, what we can advance immediately. You will hear from Amy, and not to steal her thunder, but this is a focus area of ours. Alameda is a bright line, and not a great bright line on the high injury network. And so really what is the action that we can take right now? That could look like signal retiming. We saw great improvement on West Colfax. We reduced our fatals by 87% just with signal retiming. Like sign density will come online immediately. And then also some of those crossing and intersection improvements that we will be able to turn really quickly out of this alternatives analysis, but also gives us ability on all of these to drive development, to ensure that, we're redeveloping the street with our partners in a way that aligns to an ultimate idea in a reimagined street. 38th Avenue, a really critical corridor for us in addition to all the rest. Sheridan and the Fox. We are leading this and we plan to complete this year. This is also, of course, safety multimodal, but also the green infrastructure is a high priority on this corridor. We're moving through alternatives analysis today. And really doing that analysis is where we're at. And then we'll move into design on those near-term recommendations and then developing that plan for the ultimate vision. Sheridan needs a lot of work, sidewalks specifically right away is certainly a challenge. This is also a study being led out of the region, the entire extent from I-76 to Hamden. We are just kicking off. So we're just going through procurement now, and we'll plan to kick off in midsummer, really with that focus of safety and multimodal, but really pedestrian and safety is the goal here. Going through procurement right now, and we just are active in RFP. So not a whole lot that maybe we can discuss because we're just kicking off, but the scope here is, of course, looking at the existing conditions. We'll have robust engagement with community, developing that vision, the ultimate vision, and then those short-term improvements. Colorado Boulevard, so this is kind of a two-pair. This is being led out of the state, out of CDOT, 52nd to Hamden. We plan to have recommendations this summer, and this is really a safety multimodal analysis where it's the short-term improvements that are coming in first, but ultimately is how we bring in the bus rapid transit along the corridor. So this is one that the state is committed to turning service in the very near term. But prior to that is just understanding through that analysis what we can do in the interim. So that second part of the pair is the BRT. So this is advancing a full alternative analysis to get us prepared for federal funding to advance bus rapid transit. 3 alternatives are being analyzed right now, which is mixed flow BRT, side running BRT, and then the center running BRT, similar to what you see on Colfax. Here's the schedule for that. So you can see service turning in 2030, which is very advantageous, but we are have a lot of urgency to make sure that we hit this schedule. And I'll come back to federal, but that's kind of a similar scenario there. Probably should have put those in a bit different order, but to pop in here, 17th, 18th, another high injury network focus on Vision Zero safety and bus priority. We are leading this and we're moving into final design. Construction dollars are not included at the time, so really standing us up for future funding. There will definitely be some safety improvements, though, that we can bring in the near term. So where we are in the process is really developing those conceptual designs and exciting opportunity, especially as we think about the land use along the corridor. And then downtown bus priority package. So think of this as operational improvements. We've done a lot of investment along Blake and Market with bus-only lanes, but this is really TSP and how we start to move our buses more frequently, and a lot of behind the scenes, I would say, investment that you don't necessarily see, but really provides great benefit to our multimodal space. And we're at our first kind of touch point within community in reviewing some of those alternatives analysis. Parking has been a big conversation, but we are not removing, very rarely removing parking in the core. It would be at intersections where we need to do daylighting for our buses, but really it's kind of an operational improvement and investment. And then Federal Boulevard. So similar to Colorado, being led out of the state, out of CDOT. The extents are 120th to Dartmouth. And we went through alternatives analysis kind of pre-AA, and we determined through city analysis that we would have side running. And that's what the state is advancing and looking at turning service kind of in that same time frame as Colorado in 2030. And then just wrapping up here on the RSAs, these weren't on the original map of the corridor studies because they're a bit different in process and analysis. So these are road safety audits where we really are working to understand a crash picture and identifying mitigation measures appropriate to that crash picture. So the team goes out, we do existing conditions, we analyze both in the dark and in day. We know that the nighttime functions and operates very, very differently. If you think about a federal, we have 80 miles an hour. traveling along the corridor, where we might not see that in the day. So really making sure that our improvements align to all conditions. And these are really fast turn burn. So work order processing, we could have like longer term signal rebuilds, but the goal here is to really incorporate the recommendations as soon as possible and work to mitigate the crash picture that we're seeing on the high injury network. And so you can see the 9 or so corridors that are coming into play here, and they overlap with the work that's happening. So for instance, on, well, Evans isn't shown, but that is an RSA that we have working. These are part of a Safer Streets for All grant that we received. So if we think about Sheridan, that was one I shared with you all around Dr. Cog. This is embedded into some of that work and working to understand what we can do in the very, very near term. So think quick build as we think about North Federal, Park, 20th, Sheridan, Quebec, Colorado Boulevard, pulling out, so we're coordinated within the efforts that are happening. But then the goal and really the outcome here is to invest and improve immediately. And that is what I had for you. So I will stop sharing so I can see you and am available for any questions that you may have.
So that's a lot of work. A lot of it is
Yes.
concurrent work. And I think you said that although the designs, the outcomes, the recommendations are quite different among them, the thing that's in common is you're focusing on the high injury network. Is that right?
Yes, and the transit priority network.
And the transit priority network. Okay. And the road safety audits, are those also high injury network focused?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
All on the high injury network. Yes.
Okay, great. We have a few questions in the chat. We'll start with David Mincer.
Okay.
I had two questions. I think I don't have much more to add, but the first question was, is North Broadway on your radar, extending the bike lane and transit lanes north from Spear? And also when you're at 17th, 18th, trying to cross those is pretty rough. And I had heard, I think in one of the Colfax meetings, that maybe they might be converted to two-way. Is that on the table as an option?
So to answer your first question on North Broadway, absolutely critical connection into our city. And so although the multimodal improvements that we've just built connect into the trail, right? So we do have a complete network there. What good looks like is extension all the way to Colfax. And so that we do have some really high level preliminary design, but working on how we advance that. That was part of our tip. What we're kind of flagging as a potential tip opportunity, but looking at those big dollars for how we advance that. So absolutely high priority for us. And then on 17th, 18th, the alternatives that are being developed today really look at narrowing the roadway. So not two-weighing the street per se, but really how do we provide for minimizing the crossing distance at our intersections, thinking about how we slow the vehicles and not giving those 3 lanes of free travel. They were built to like move people in and out of the city as fast as we possibly can. Now we know the land use has grown up next to us. We have really great commercial corridors. So making sure that they are, I guess, taking potentially lanes away is more that we're thinking about than converting them from one way to two-way.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Thomas had a question about Alameda.
So we're calling the Alameda BRT with the same category as Colfax, Colorado, and Federal, but Alameda is a very different animal. How should we understand Alameda BRT compared with the other ones that have much more frequent, much higher needs and much more space in order to work?
Yes. Yeah, great question. All of our corridors and streets have different contexts. And so we know we need to be context sensitive in our design. And so thinking through what that looks like, they'll run through many different alternatives through that process. And so they will look at dedicated bus lanes, but then also that phasing. And maybe that's not in the entire corridor. We know to get FTA funding, 60% of the corridor has to be dedicated, but not all of it. And so how we incorporate some of the other elements like priority bus at our signals, right? Get the buses advancing before the vehicles, where we might not have that dedicated right of way. So those alternatives are being developed. They haven't been. So I would really encourage you, if you're not already a part of that process, to weigh in there. But yeah, not to say one size fits all and it all has to look exactly the same. We will really move forward with a context sensitive design.
We'll continue with a BRT question. Bruce, you had a BRT question?
Yeah, I was just curious, given RTD staffing problems, if they will find it easier or more difficult to staff up for BRT buses.
Yes, great question. And one that, I feel like in times we're ahead of RTD in our investments and our improvements. So this very, like what highlights is the 17th, 18th, they've reduced service from 15-minute headways to 30-minute headways. And so how we phase the investments to ensure that the service is able to catch up. So absolutely, those conversations are happening right now to make sure, like, especially with federal and Colorado, since those are kind of the first to turn, that we do have the resources in place to be able to meet the need of the corridor. But it's a very appropriate and timely comment that you make, because it is a challenge and something that we'll have to work through to make sure that we're supporting the RTD and the rest in any ways that we can, to make sure that they have the drivers and are able to operate in alignment with our needs, our goals, and the infrastructure that's in place.
And I see that Stuart Summers from RTD came on to camera. Stuart, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just going to add quickly. I'm Stuart Summers, Chief Communications and Engagement Officer at RTD. We've actually made great strides in hiring operators, both in bus and light rail. I just was checking when I saw this question. Right now, we're sitting at about 87% positions occupied for bus operators. Last month was our largest new class of operators we've had since before the COVID pandemic. So I think we're starting to see things turn around as far as hiring, retaining employees, and ensuring that we're able to deliver service from a workforce challenge.
And when BRT designs are used and the bus isn't stuck in traffic, a shift of an operator can actually do more runs, I would imagine. So getting the city and the state to make the streets work well for transit lets RTD to do its job. So
yeah, that's exactly right.
Heidi has a question, especially about the West area.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to see so many West area high injury networks on this outline. And I was just curious, is the West area the only sort of overall plan that we have over there is our West area plan with quality of life and mobility recommendations to pull the priorities of all these networks together, these streets together. How is that being integrated? How is that plan being integrated? For example, I heard on a couple of the streets that green infrastructure or transit-oriented development, like along New York and stuff, is being highlighted, or Broadway. So who at DOTI is focused on integrating our plan, the West area plans recommendations, to make sure that everything is smooth and consistent around those improvements in the West?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It's really, really important to make sure that we're building upon past work, not recreating or duplicating. And so one great thing about Denver Moves Everyone, which is our strategic transportation plan, it mined all past planning and it brought it into a database, something that we call the DME database. And this could be things outside of transportation, but that relate to it. And so that as our teams move into these spaces, they're pulling that information as a starting point as part of our existing conditions. And so looking at that, that's really to your point of like, who's responsible, it would be the project manager, which on here is Phoebe Fuchs. I don't know if you've been engaged in the 38th Avenue, but that would be something that we're pulling into our existing conditions to understand what past planning recommendations have been made so that we can advance in alignment with the past work.
So would the West area be considered a past plan? It was just
Yes.
approved a year ago, so.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And where would we find all that stuff being integrated? Like where is that document you talked about?
Denver Moves Everyone database. It's an internal, but I mean, if you go to DME, you can see our 6-year capital planning. And that's what I'm referring to as like the database. So it's looking at a 6 and 12-year plan that really showcases like these are things that are not funded, but that we want to coordinate and make sure that we're integrating into our work that we're advancing. So that would be a great place to start. And then as well as 38th Avenue, like the actual projects that are advancing on the west side, to ensure that, you see that past work within that too. And are you referring to the neighborhood planning initiative on the area plan? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And we also have CPD who leads those initiatives, and we're right next to them too in DOTI on the mobility side, but they are also on our project management teams as we advance the work, that we also have that kind of expertise and technical ability weighing into the recommendations.
From what I've seen, each of these corridor studies does a lot of public outreach. I see some notes with, meetings for people to go to, ways to get involved, dropping pins on online maps and that sort of thing. The safety studies you talked about at the end, that's a different process, though. That's more of just a technical analysis.
That's correct. Yes, it's very technical and quick to do analysis and then turn on, kind of plan to land, as I call it. We're doing quick work based on data and technical ability, and then we're moving into investments. And these are things like signing, striping. It could be a conversion of lanes where we've taken striped out, scored a lane, not on an entire corridor, but it's more operational improvements than kind of like a full reimagining and setting vision. It's really reactive, I would say, to a crash picture that we have today, and putting those countermeasures to mitigate the crash in the future.
Okay, so we're starting to see this Vision Zero cycle of we see evidence of a problem. We're going to go look at how to change the infrastructure to prevent that problem in the future.
Yes, exactly. Where the other corridors are much more proactive, I would say, like really thinking long term. How do we want to reimagine the street to function and serve our community in a different way?
Great. And speaking of our community, it was great that you showed, and I had no understanding actually prior to this, that so many of the corridors are being studied with leads outside of Denver. And when you showed the South Broadway, if I'm correct, it showed above curb, and you verbalized this, above curb bikeways on either side of the street. I don't think we really have those in Denver, but that looks really, really progressive.
Yes. And that grade separation is so important. If you think about Brighton, we do have that condition along Brighton that we improved.
Yep.
And working to advance that in any way that we can be, especially on corridors that are these arterials that are fast moving and aren't always built for people. So where we can get that curb separating our bikes from the vehicles and not having like a false kind of protection around a flex post, that's where we want to move. So yeah, that was the goal there and the vision that they've set.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of Brighton. I'd forgotten about that stretch. So it really is sort of 3 levels. There's the sidewalk level, there's the bike level, and then there's the road level after the drainage.
Yes.
Oh, fascinating.
Yep. And they flipped on Brighton and it really is in most cases one level, right? But you do have the separation from the pedestrians, and then on Brighton it goes to water quality and then the bike. And then thinking through, there's opportunity to put the water quality up next to the curb, and that even gives better buffer, I would argue, to the bikes and the peds. But yeah, different ways of thinking about that, but really just grade separation. Our vulnerable users are grade separated from the vehicles.
Oh, maybe there'll be some friendly competition between the cities to get the best facilities.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Healthy competition. I always welcome it. It's a good thing.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And this really helps. I think individual neighborhoods are hearing about corridor studies in this area, in their area, but I don't think I've ever seen a presentation about how all the corridor studies are proceeding, and I imagine there's a list of them to come after the ones that you showed. So
Yes.
we'll have you back in a few months or in a year to give a roundup of all the progress and new corridors being studied.
Yes. Well, happy to join you anytime. Thanks for having me this evening. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Well,
Good night.
good night. We'll now turn to the second topic on the agenda. Stuart Summers is here from RTD, and I think he's joined by Jesse Carter to talk about, as I mentioned at the top, some pretty significant changes that are going on, maintenance projects that will affect how light rail works this summer and next summer, and then subsequent changes or concurrent changes to bus services to keep people moving. Stuart, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you for having me this evening, Joel, and everyone for joining. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Stuart Summers, the Chief Communications and Engagement Officer at RTD. I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues this evening. Jesse Carter, our Senior Manager for Service Development, is on the call. And then also Pauline Haberman, who is our Special Projects Manager, is also on the call. So at the end, if there's questions, happy to address those. But as Joel mentioned, we're going to talk through a few projects and some impacts to both rail and bus services, and happy to answer any other questions you may have at the end. But here's a quick rundown of what we'll go through. I mentioned the projects. We'll talk about some service changes happening at the end of this month, and then some resources and support that we'll be providing for customers. I think it's important to start out by just emphasizing the 3 strategic initiatives that RTD has been focused on over the last year and that we'll continue to focus on. Back to basics, people power, and welcoming transit environment. Back to basics is really why we're here this evening. This is getting back to a state of good repair, ensuring that previous investments are maintained and that we're operating a system that is safe and reliable. People power, the question came in earlier about, do you have enough operators? Having the employment levels needed to provide service. So the agency's been focused on people power. And then welcoming transit environment. I saw a comment from Bruce in the chat about seeing a lot of security out on the system and that perception and that desire to have a safe system, a safe welcoming transit environment. And so that's something else we've been focused on. I'll touch on at the very end. So state of good repair really is ensuring that agencies' priorities and investments remain intact. Our light rail system is approaching 30 years old in the downtown loop. And so it's time for us to do a full redepth reconstruction, which I'll talk about. RTD has about $9 billion in fixed assets. So this includes everything from facilities and vehicles to the actual infrastructure of track and signals, bridges, and stations that are out across the 8-county service area. So the first project I want to talk about is our downtown rail reconstruction project. And so this summer, we will focus on what we call the downtown loop. This is part of RTD's first light rail line, this inaugural line that opened in 1994. Currently, the D, H, and L lines run through the downtown loop. And so as we're all well aware, the trains operate in a street running capacity. So there's not a dedicated right-of-way, which means that pedestrians and vehicles, cyclists are also entering this right-of-way when trains are not there. There's a number of public utilities that exist under this rail alignment that we have to take into consideration as we're doing this project. And then also the downtown loop has what we call paved track. So some parts of our system are open ballasted, which you can see in this picture on the right. This would be the track that you would commonly think about. But in the downtown loop, we have this paved track, which takes a little bit extra work to do this full reconstruction effort. So before I jump into this phase that's coming up this summer, I want to just emphasize that we've been doing some isolated projects since 2012. And I think we're probably all familiar with some of the service impacts that have happened during this period of time. We've been targeting some very isolated parts of the track, and we've now reached a point where we can't continue to do these Band-Aid fixes, that we have to do this full depth reconstruction in a very focused manner instead of focusing on a little bit of track during periods of time. So this project is focused on planned closures versus unplanned service disruptions. I mentioned that this part of the system is 30 years old, and it was built to last 30 years. So we're focused on what do the next 30 years look like for light rail? How do we ensure that this investment is maintained? This will happen over 4 phases in 2 years. And the first phase, which we will be doing this summer, we're only doing one phase in 2024, are what we're calling 5 at-grade intersections. And 152 million has been appropriated for all 4 phases. So for this first project, we will focus on those 5 intersections. I already mentioned the 30 years, really trying to ensure that we maintain these assets in a state of good repair and then mitigate these service disruptions in a planned manner. So the 5 intersections, the project will kick off May 26th with our May service change, and will run through mid-September, September 15th. Not all the intersections will be reconstructed at one time. So of these 5 intersections, I'll show you a map on the next slide. But we're going to do this through a progression. And so we're trying to limit this impact as much as possible. We've been working with the city and county of Denver on street closures, traffic detour plans, just really trying to ensure that we're maintaining access to businesses and residents that are in the area. So these are the 5 intersections that are part of this phase 1, as I mentioned, between May 26th and mid-September. Stoughton 15th, Californian 15th, Stoughton 17th, Californian 17th, and then the Broadway and Welton intersection. As we're all very well familiar with these intersections, a lot of traffic crosses these intersections, drives over the tracks. After 30 years of vehicles, a lot of it's RTD's own buses. It's really done an impact on these tracks. And so that's part of this reason is it's time to pull everything out, go all the way down multiple feet and do a rebuild. So rail impacts for this project, the D line will be rerouted to Union Station. So we'll go from Littleton Mineral Station to Union Station. The H line will also be rerouted to DUS, going from Florida Station to Union Station. And then the L line service, which goes through the loop and then out the Welton corridor, will be suspended during this project. And so we're encouraging customers to use bus route 43. It closely mirrors the L line as a fantastic alternative if you're trying to access along the Welton corridor and into the downtown central business district. In 2025, we will focus on phase 2, which is going back and doing some repairs on a full depth reconstruction of the mid block. So this is between the intersections in areas that haven't been previously replaced. And this will have that same impact on the D, H, and L lines. Phase 3, also next year, will focus on Colfax alignment. So going out from the convention center out to about Colfax at Auraria Station, impact to the D and H lines next year. And then phase 4 is the Welton Street corridor. So same thing, a full depth reconstruction of the existing track on that corridor. Also doing some station accessibility enhancements at that same time, and then an impact to the L line in 2025. So these are the 4 phases over the next couple of years, really an impact to this oldest part of the light rail system. We've really been trying to be proactive at ensuring that customers and community and stakeholders are very well aware of this project. If you haven't visited our website, we have our Rail Project webpage. It's constantly updated with information. We're going through about 250 outreach tactics right now. So we have a paid marketing campaign that's underway, a lot of banners, digital signs, social media, outreach, really trying to ensure that the community is well aware of this project. We also are underway visiting businesses and residents in the area to ensure that they're aware of the impact and anything that questions that they may have. And we also have a stakeholder partner toolkit. And so for this group especially, if you're communicating with community members or individuals that may be potentially impacted by this rail project, we have resources you can download in English and Spanish. There's news release copy, newsletter, sample social media posts, photos, video. All these resources are freely available for anyone in the community to use as you're helping to be an extension of our team and to communicate some of the impacts to this project. brought on by this project. The second thing I want to focus on is coping panels project. And so this is the second and final phase of a 2-year project that is along I-25. And so this is impacting the E, H, and R lines. And the coping panels are essentially those retaining walls that run along I-25. Last year, we started the project in earnest. We did about half of the work in 2023. The project will resume on May 26th. And it can really only be performed during these warm weather months. We get a lot of questions about, can you do this over the full year and try and limit the impact? And it has to be done during these warm weather months. They're working on the capstones on these retaining walls, anchoring them and putting a sealant over it. And so this really has to be done, during the summer construction season. The reason for the impact to service is trains have to single track around work crews that are in the alignment. So you can see from this photo, there's a lift. There's a gentleman that's working on this project, is directly on one of the tracks. And so we have trains running in both directions on the same set of track. And so we have to pull trains into stations, let other trains go around them, and really do a coordinated effort to ensure that, obviously safety for customers on the system, but also for the work crews in the area. This project will conclude also in mid-September, and then it will be finished. And so I know this has been a very painful project. We hear a lot of customer questions and concerns about the coping panels project, but we are excited and looking ahead to having this wrapped up this year. For service impacts related to coping panels, train frequencies will be temporarily adjusted between that May 26th and September 15th. So our line will continue a 30-minute frequency, and then E and H line trains will be adjusted to 1-hour frequencies. And the reason for this is with that single tracking last year, we tried to do it at about a 30-minute frequency and realized that we weren't able to keep a consistent schedule. So after meeting with a lot of community groups, getting a lot of feedback, we're adjusting to this 1-hour frequency because this is something where we feel we'll be able to provide a better schedule, better on-time performance. Trains will still do that single tracking, as I mentioned, but anything north of Southmore Station will have 2 trains each hour that will go to Denver Union Station. And so we're encouraging customers, if you're north of Southmore, that's essentially a train every 30 minutes into downtown. Also, trying to explore other ways to reach your destination, albeit a bus. And so there's a lot of bus service. And so trying to help customers understand there may be other alternative methods outside rail that you can reach your destination using RTD. I now want to turn it over to my colleague, Jesse Carter, our Senior Manager of Service Development, to talk through some of the service changes coming up on May 26th.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm not sure if my computer is working well. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well, Jesse.
Awesome. Thanks, Joel, and thank you for the invite. I really appreciate participating in this process. So looking at the service changes, many of you may know, and judging from some of the comments in the chat, there are quite a few of you who actually know a lot about how RTD works and how light rail works. So I'm surprised by some of the comments, and I can't wait to start the discussion about those comments. So 3 times a year, RTD reviews our system, the system network, as far as on-time performance and looking at our ridership. We typically do those looks for changes that occur in January, May, and August/September. So May 26th, we'll be implementing a number of changes, some of them minor, many of them major, of course, relating to the program that Stuart just described. And we also want to let you know that the service changes have another purpose, and that is to allow our operators and other employees, frontline employees, to vote different work. So as you may know, with the fall, we usually have school going back in service. But in May, that's when the schools are out of service. So we have to cut back a lot of the additional tripper service that we provide during the rest of the year. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read every single one of these changes. I promise you that it would take too long and you'll probably be tired of hearing my voice already. However, we have a number of the changes that Stuart had mentioned The first one, by chance, the 0L, is one of the service changes that we are proposing to mitigate the fact that the central corridor loop will not be operating. So we're proposing on the 0L to actually operate that midday. Currently, it operates only during the peak periods. Going to the second line, all the other changes on the first line are either school services being reduced or running time analysis and minor trip changes. However, the Platte Valley Flex Ride, we are proposing to change that service to operate more like a regular Flex Ride. We're hoping to also station that vehicle somewhere near 10th and Osage to offer another opportunity for service to Auraria campus. Looking at the third line, the free mall ride and free metro ride, those are both somewhat related. We are proposing to turn down the frequency on the free mall ride and then to actually implement the free metro ride. If you might remember, the metro ride hasn't operated since 2020, but that service was born in 2014 and offered an alternative path using 18th and 19th Streets between Denver Union Station and the Civic Center Station. So we're proposing to reinstate that on a 10-minute frequency. The rest of the services are, again, seasonal. So looking down at the rail services, we have, as Stuart mentioned before, the D, E, H, L, R, and W. Those are all light rail lines. And I want to mention that they'll have a more long-term change, and that is a reduction in the span of services Monday through Thursday. Instead of running as late as 2 a.m., they'll be running until midnight. The inline is the only service increase on rail that we're representing at this point in time, and that's due to the inline actually doing very well on the weekends, Friday and Saturday. We are proposing to add an 11 p.m. trip on that, and we're looking forward to see what that ridership looks like. Also, as Stuart mentioned, the coping panel project will have effects on the E and H line. They will be reduced, have a reduced frequency. They'll have a combined headway frequency of every 30 minutes, and that results in, unfortunately, an hourly headway. It's something that we didn't necessarily want to do, but it's something that we have to do in order to get this work complete. I should mention that with the coping panel, we hope that in September, that project will end for good, for the foreseeable future, and we won't have the same type of impact. The W line will also have service span changes as well. So next slide. Hopefully what I've explained to you in the previous slide makes this slide a little easier and kind of shores up exactly what we're talking about as far as our span of services and how they're impacted, and more importantly, how they're not impacted. So looking at the D line, the detour to Denver Union Station, some of you might remember the old C line, which we used to operate between the Southwest Corridor and Denver Union Station. So it'll be on that pattern. The E line, 1 hour frequencies, and then we'll have the service span adjustments on Monday through Thursday, but not on Friday and Saturday. The H line, again, like the E line, will also have the service span adjustment, and we'll have 1 hour frequencies due to the coping panel. And the L line service will be suspended. And that suspension, we are pointing people to the Route 43. And yes, we know the Route 38 is also another alternative, but we're pointing to the Route 43 because it actually has capacity to take on the additional ridership, and also provides a direct connection to Auraria, which we know is a very strong ridership generator for the L line. On the N line, as I mentioned before, we're extending a Saturday evening service. And on the R line, it will also have some impacts. So we'll have some minor changes on it due to the fact that the coping panel schedules will be adjusted. And the W line will also be impacted in the same way as the rest of the light rail services with service span impacts. Next slide, please. So as further description of how we're trying to mitigate the fact that the downtown loop is not operating, we are providing, of course, the 0L, as I mentioned before, but also the reinstatement of the Metro ride will allow us some flexibility, along with the free mall ride, allow us some flexibility to offer trips in and through the downtown area. So the free Metro ride is scheduled to operate between 5:40 a.m. and 7 p.m. and the free mall ride will have its current level or span of service, but will only operate at a 10-minute frequency. Next slide. All right, I hand it back to you, Stuart.
Thanks, Jesse. I appreciate that. In conclusion, I just want to highlight a few resources and some updates related to RTD services. A question came in or a comment came in about security and personal safety across the system. So I want to just say, provide an update that currently RTD has about 60 post-certified officers. A couple of years ago, we had 19, so they've made some steady growth. We have 20 recruits in the police academy that will graduate this month. So we're focused on increasing the presence so we can dispatch them appropriately across the entire system. Also, this last weekend, we introduced an overnight shift. So we now have 24-hour police support across the entire system. And then we're focused on hiring also mental health clinicians and homeless outreach coordinators, which will be added additional to what we currently have this coming year. If you're not aware, we have our Transit Watch app. This is a quick and easy way for people to anonymously report concerns that they see on the system. All of these are tracked by our dispatch in real time. I can tell you I use this personally when I'm on the D line and have reported concerns and had security dispatch, within minutes and had things addressed. And so it's available in English and Spanish. It's free to download. Also, customers, you can call dispatch or you can even text with dispatch 24 hours a day. One thing we're excited to introduce this month is we have the Impact Team. And so what we are putting together are agency ambassadors. We have more than 30 of these employee ambassadors that will actually be dispatched across the entire system to assist customers. We're going to dispatch them during large events, service disruptions like the Downtown Project and Coping Panels Project, peak service times, really just to ensure that customers have the information they need to plan a trip, wayfinding information, answer frequently asked questions, address any personal safety concerns that may be out there. It's really focused on that welcoming transit environment that I mentioned earlier. And so this is underway right now, and we're excited to have this project, especially ahead of a busy summer season of not only some disruption and projects, but also just community events and festivals and concerts and things that will be happening in our community. And then I just want to mention the Next Ride app. And so all of our summer schedules and those service impacts have been loaded into the app. And so anyone can go to our Next Ride app, go to our website, and you can actually plan a trip for the future. So you could plan a trip for June 11th, and you'll be able to see any of those impacts related to the Coping Panels Project or the Downtown Rail Reconstruction Project and see what schedule may be available for you. The app is available in 5 languages. You can see service alerts by route or line, station, facility, and then also you can see real-time vehicle location. So if you're at a stop or a station and wondering where your bus is, you can track that in real time. And then we also receive about 300,000 unique users a month on this app. So it's seen significant growth. This is really a great tool if you're working with people and they're trying to understand how to use the system. The Next Ride app provides all that information and how to purchase fare and the total cost of a trip. And then the last thing is our call center. And so we have agents available if anyone has concerns and maybe doesn't feel comfortable using the Next Ride app. Welcome to call our call center, and agents can help provide real-time information, trip planning information, updates, address any concerns that may come in, and obviously language assistance available on that as well. And that concludes what I have prepared, and happy to answer some questions.
Now, let's see if we can get in some rapid fire questions. Thomas had a question about the 0L.
So the 0L has a major 1 mile gap between 9th Avenue and 1st Avenue. That has a pretty good amount of employment, even though the Spear Highway goes right through it. Is there any way that we can adjust it so that at least 5th Avenue or 6th Avenue is covered in order to accommodate those people that work in that half mile or that in between that mile?
I should have mentioned it before. I brought a friend along to help me answer questions. Dan Merritt is our senior service planner scheduler for the West area, which also covers the downtown. And I did ask him if he could answer that question. Dan?
Hello, thank you, Jesse. I was working on getting an answer together in the chat, but I can just do it verbally now if that's good for everybody. As a limited route, one of the necessities is limited number of stops. For the Zero Limited to serve its job of getting people quickly from Civic Center down to I-25 and Broadway, we need to limit the number of stops available so that it can quickly progress down and go back to downtown and get more people. If someone has a need to get to one of the stops during that gap, the best option for you would be a regular zero instead of a Zero Limited. The regular zero, you can transfer to it at the stops 9th or 1st, and it will serve every stop between them. The zero is running very frequently these days, so it should not be tough to make a transfer, and that's the necessity to get through them. But Jesse's back. If there's anything more you would like to add, I'm happy to pass the mic.
Sure. It was a great question, and we do recognize the fact that, that gap is there. I believe there was at one point in time a stop at 7th Avenue, if I remember correctly, back in the day. And was one of the things that, in order to smooth things out and make our system run smoother and faster, that stop had been eliminated. However, as traffic changes and as ridership, or we get more requests for more frequent stops, we will consider it. But again, thank you for your question.
Yeah, I'd like to suggest that for future considerations that we reimagine the 0L as a local rather than as a limited.
Okay.
June has a question about the rerouting of rail and an alternative that wasn't taken. June?
Yeah, so very quickly, was it considered to do train turnarounds at Convention Center Station during this first phase of downtown light rail reconstruction? Just to ensure that there's that more direct access. I know going to Union Station and then hopping on the metro ride is still a good option, but that's still another 10, 15 minutes onto a commute.
Sure.
So was there consideration of turnarounds at Convention Center for these light rail lines, at least during the first phase of construction?
Yes, when I mentioned those very good questions and the fact that you all seem to be a very astute audience, is the fact that you mentioned short turning a train, knowing that we do have the interconnects actually to do it. So that was an excellent point, and yes, we did consider it. The problem is, at this point, those interconnects to operate in the reverse direction wouldn't be automated. They would have to be manually tripped and manually controlled. So we don't have the personnel in light rail to actually throw at that type of issue. I would have preferred to go that way as well, because it would have, provided a lot of decent walk access to the downtown, but it's just something we couldn't actually manually handle at this point in time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, good to hear there's a reason for it.
Okay. Well, thank you for your question. I appreciate it.
And we have a question from Lucia about the coping panels.
Hi, hello there. Yeah, I'm just wondering, when T-Rex was going on and other big construction projects, they worked on them overnight rather than be disruptive during the day. I'm just curious to why RTD didn't choose that route, have them working on them overnight so that they could still do two trains during the day and not lose ridership. Because once you lose the ridership, they're not coming back.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the challenges with this project is it's not just the work performed, but it's actually bringing the equipment into the alignment to do the work. And so in order to bring the equipment in, it's not just a drop it in and get going. It actually takes multiple days staging it on the alignment, doing the work. And then anytime we move it out, it takes, a significant amount of time as well. So if we tried to do it overnight, there would still be time that you'd have to shut down the system to stage all the equipment to do that work. We recognize this is going to be challenging and disruptive. We knew that last year as well, and we heard a lot of concerns, but this is one of those things where we can't just move the equipment easily in and out with this amount of work that has to be performed, especially with the lifts getting up as high on those coping panels. So yeah, great question though.
Thank you. I'll just put in a question of my own. Coming from the 5 Points Curtis Park perspective, we've long wanted, and the 5 Points bid is a long wanted Welton Street to be a frequent transit-rich corridor. And it's drifted further and further away from that with the L line changes separated from the D line and frequency reductions, et cetera. Looking ahead, Fast Tracks has an extension on Downing for that light rail to go to 38th and Blake. But what I've heard for years is that there are more and more challenges being uncovered, not only financial challenges, of course, but operational challenges with implementing what was envisioned for Downing. So what I'm hearing from the community right now is, won't RTD talk with us about a vision for transit-rich Welton before investing in a full-depth rebuild of the rail? Because perhaps what we're doing now isn't working, and spending a lot of money to re-implement it, even though it's in the name of good maintenance, might be better directed towards a different vision. And if we don't engage talking about it now, we'll miss this window.
Well, Joel, I'll say that, you've said a lot in that statement. I'm not looking at that as a question at all, because of the fact that what you're stating is a really good point. And that is, 30th and Blake was envisioned as part of Fast Tracks connecting the University of Colorado A line. I guess I don't have to call it that anymore. Connecting the A line to the L line. But it's a corridor that has, a lot of impacts. You know them, being everything from house takes to road sharing and signal complications that are associated with it. One of the folks that I've worked with for a long time had the vision also of trying to perhaps connect that corridor with a corridor that would go further down to Broadway and reconnect on a secondary path, coming into the downtown via Broadway. Welton as its own corridor and having the higher frequency services always been, and you know what I'm going to say next, it's always had the problem with single track in that area between switch 21 or roughly between 24th and 25th, and then all the way up to 29th is the limiter as to how often we can run in that section. So I think we would have to reimagine not only the existing rail, but how we could operate two-way before we could really address the frequent service that you're talking about. But I think it's certainly worth talking about, and I can, again, it's not my area. I'm more short-term planning to talk about that. But perhaps we could set a time where we could set you up with folks in the long-range planning and talk about the issue and as a whole, and then look at the long-range planning aspect of it. But within the SOP, no changes were really supported. And when we're talking about the SOP, it only runs between now and 2027. But no changes were supported in the SOP for the L line at this point.
Okay. Well, I know there's a lot of people here in the neighborhoods, the business district, the council office, and so forth that would love to engage sooner, even knowing the Fast Tracks money isn't available now, but seeing if we can come up with a vision that's more consistent with what we did in our area plan, because continuing this is just continuing a service that, frankly, people would use the 43 and the 38 rather than the L, because it's infrequent and doesn't go anywhere. So I will follow up with that.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is a high impact set of projects, and we want people across the city to know about it.
Okay.
Appreciate you joining us. All right. Our next speaker is June Churchill. Going back to Michael Henry was on. It looks like he just dropped. Michael Henry was one of the founders of INC, and for many, many years ran the zoning and planning committee for INC. And he would occasionally remark, maybe we need a lobbyist. Maybe we need somebody who can speak about what the community wants and not just what the interests that can afford a paid lobbyist can do. And in addition to, we heard at the start of the legislative session, Denver Streets Partnership, giving us a preview of the mobility-related bills at the state. We have a new asset on our side here with June Churchill as a registered lobbyist who's also a volunteer and is taking her input from community groups like the Denver Bicycle Lobby and Greater Denver Transit. So to give a wrap up for the legislative session, mobility bills specifically for the session that ended just yesterday, I'll turn it over to June Churchill.
All right, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Joel. Can everyone hear me and see me? I've got my screen shared so I can't see if there's a thumbs up.
Looks good.
Okay, great. Let's get started. So I'm going to be doing our legislative roundup. As Joel said, I am a registered volunteer lobbyist. I represent Greater Denver Transit and the Denver Bike Lobby. I was there in the Capitol, bill tracking, advocating for bills, and I'm here to sort of give a mobility transportation focused wrap up. I originally was going to have this be a lot more fun and entertaining and comedic, but as it turns out, doing that in a slideshow is actually way more effort than you'd expect it to be. So it's just going to be very much information heavy. But there's still a little bit of comedy at the beginning. So this session, over 700 bills were introduced. Some of them passed, a lot of them died. There were a lot of hours of filibusters. This picture was taken of Rep. Basenecker during a filibuster, very late in session when everyone was very tired and doing their best. So I'm happy to answer as many questions as you want. At the end of the presentation, I've got a lot of stuff to get through because a lot of things happened. Now I know this is a mobility focused one, but fundamentally the land use legislation I'm opening with, because it has
June,
such...
June, you're showing, I think, a different screen than you think. We're seeing all the details. Yeah, we're not seeing the full screen is what I'm saying.
Okay, let me retry something. Okay, there we go. I think I got it.
Looks great.
Great. Finished? Awesome. Okay, I am opening with land use stuff because honestly, it is super, super important to understanding mobility. So I'm going to start with the transit-oriented communities bill. I will also say this bill is over 60 pages long. It's very complicated, and I still have not read through the entire version that passed the Senate. A lot of these bills got heavily amended in like the past week. So you can imagine there's a lot of content to cover. So this one is really important. There's a few bills that passed this year that directly modified local zoning rules. There's also, for everyone to think about, there is a multi-year on-ramp for a lot of these bills. So just so you know, and this also usually has to do with zoning capacity. So it's not like, we're going to get a ton of new building immediately. It's just saying, yeah, you can build more here. But broadly, here's what the TOC bill does, from my understanding. So municipalities and MPOs and metropolitan planning organization like DRCOG, they must set zoning capacity near transit stations to meet a so-called housing opportunity goal, which has also been termed a HOG. You can see here the HOG equation. Essentially, it's looking at the areas that are within walking, biking distance to frequent-ish transit stations. And then removing all the land that we don't want to develop. So things like floodplains, parks and green space, industrial zones, basically, just this long list of exemptions where we probably shouldn't build new housing. And then you take that total land that is developable near transit stations, you'll multiply it by 40, assuming about a 40 units per acre density volume. And that's the housing opportunity goal. So that essentially is what Denver has to hit total across all their land near transit stations. So essentially Denver can pick and choose where to put that zoning capacity and where not to. And they did accommodate for most everything, I think, reasonable in terms of those exemptions for undevelopable lands. In terms of the radius we're talking about, it's half mile away from rail stations and a quarter mile away from BRT and bus stations that operate frequently. This does apply to most of Denver. I've got a map later on where I'm going to show sort of about what the effect will be. Next up, parking minimums. There's my wonderful photo with the fantastic Representative Stephanie Vigil. who ran a lot of these bills this year and is an amazing representative. This bill puts a quarter-mile radius around similar bus lines and rail stations as the TOC bill does, and just does not allow multifamily residential parking minimums or parking minimums for mixed-use properties or for adaptive reuse. Again, this is just saying that a city can't enforce that, but developers to qualify for loans are still going to have to build parking to suit demand. The whole point of this bill was just to make sure that we're not building excess parking. It does allow for one space per unit that a municipality can mandate if that local government can prove a substantial negative impact on the surrounding area. A lot of previous parking minimums, there was no evidence needed. It was just like, yeah, this seems about right. This bill actually requires data in order to enforce these multifamily residential parking minimums. It does not touch commercial properties, although I imagine maybe in a future year the legislature will come back and take a second look at commercial parking minimums. Because right now, for example, we require parking spaces near bars, which is a classic example of maybe somewhere we should reconsider parking minimums. And then finally, other land use and housing. I also wanted to include this picture of some of the sprawl that we have on the outskirts of Denver. So this is really where the inspiration for a lot of these land use bills comes from, is to take a look at the way that we've currently allowed population growth, which is in the most land intensive, water intensive, and climate intensive way possible, and saying, you know what, that's not how we want to grow anymore. We want to focus on more sustainable infill projects. Other really big ones, ADUs are going to be allowed on all lots in Denver. This was something the city was already aiming for, but the state is just kind of getting ahead of us on it. There's a lot of loans and grants to help homeowners build new ADUs, which is very, very exciting. So if any of you are homeowners and maybe wants to, build an ADU for your kids, or, to have a bit of income from rents, this is going to be a new possibility for you. Occupancy limits have been banned in our state. Housing needs assessment. So essentially municipalities will have to measure what's the housing need in their community and estimate how much housing they have right now. So actually get a better sense of the housing crisis in Colorado. There's hundreds of millions of dollars in tax credits and incentives for housing as well. There's some very exciting new tenant protections like for-cause eviction. There's warrant of habitability changes, right of first refusal to allow for more affordable housing development. This is just sort of these bills in this session is sort of setting the stage for a future wherein we're going to really need transit and active transportation options to serve people's mobility needs. So that's why I wanted to share this and ground us in this. This is the largest suite of housing bills ever passed in our state. Here's a map I threw together of the South Denver area that I lived in for a while, counting up all the sort of bus routes and rail stations to see sort of what are going to be the impacts of all these bills. So the ADU bill, everything you can see here, ADUs will be allowed in. You can see the shaded areas is where that TOC law will apply. And of course, you can see, and there are like wash parks in there. There's a golf course in there. There's rail line right of ways. All that stuff is exempt parcels that won't be counted towards housing capacity. Don't worry. But that's sort of that shading is where we're going to have to calculate those housing opportunity goals, and then rezone to sort of meet that total zoning capacity requirement. And then the blue here you see is where multifamily residential parking minimums won't be able to be enforced or enacted anymore. So, and then of course, part of the reason that these land use reforms died last year was because a bunch of local governments showed up at the Capitol and very reasonably said, hey, adding density is great. I mean, a lot of them didn't say that, but it was adding this stuff is fine, but you can't add it without new mass transit service and expanded transit services to make sure that these people can access jobs and amenities in the grocery store and childcare and all that sort of stuff. So here's where we get into, in my opinion, probably the most exciting part of this session is that we have a litany of bills to give record-breaking amounts of state funding for transit. And here's a beautiful picture of, I believe, the N line, which RTD, I'm very excited that the sign's been doing very, very well. But let's start with the really big news, which was Senate Bill 230. This was the massive compromise bill that is a deal between the oil and gas industry and the state and environmental NGOs. So the largest players in the industry have agreed to new permanent fees on oil and gas that will go directly to funding wildlife and land remediation, which is about 20% of the funds, and transit for the other 80%. So you can see here, and this is a massive development. We've never seen this kind of state investment in transit. So you can see on the right here, I threw together a spreadsheet sort of estimating what are the dollar amounts we could expect from this. So importantly, in that transit bucket, we can expect to see operations and ridership increases are 70% of the funds there. So these funds are majority going to actual operations, which is fairly rare from my understanding. 10% is matching funds that can be claimed by local governments and other municipalities and entities. Those will essentially be projects like multimodal access projects to get to transit and other like station improvements and bus stop improvements and broad, competitive grant projects to help improve transit access. And then that other 20% is for passenger rail. And I did some math to see what could we expect the drawdown for RTD to be. And you can see on the bottom there that on average, I'm expecting RTD to get about $50 million per year for operations, about $7 million for those competitive matching grants, and then about $20.5 million annually for passenger rail projects. This moves Colorado from 44th in state funding for transit to the top half, which is awesome. And also there's an additional requirement, which I think is very fair, that if the state is throwing RTD capital projects money for rail projects, that they must use their own fast track FISA account money to actually access those rail funds. So I view those very much as like a multiplier of RTD's current capital funds. This bill requires RTD to report how they plan to finish fast tracks by 2034. So that is the B line, the N line extension, the L line extension, and the Southwest Rail extension. Those all four are in that report. And ultimately, this is super, super exciting. The state is going to be throwing RTD about $80 million a year, which is awesome. Seeing the state actually get invested in RTD is huge, in my opinion. I've heard some concerns that maybe that $23.5 million from that previous bill is going to go to FRPR and the Polis's favorite trains, which is partially true. However, they've got their own bill. So SB 24-184 is going to institute a new rental car fee of $3 per day for car rentals that are between 1 day and 30 days in duration. It's going to generate about $60 million per year. The whole point of this was to be matching funds to secure federal dollars for Front Range passenger rail. This money is going to be split up a little bit. What I've heard is that this source will go to 3 different projects. Front Range passenger rail, which I expect to get the lion's share of funds up front. Bustang service expansions, which is awesome. Bustang is doing great and I love them. And also Northern Rocky Mountain passenger rail. So there's a plan to have trains running between Denver Union Station and Steamboat Springs, Craig, and Hayden. That's a bit further out than Front Range passenger rail. There's also some other things in that bill, which, for example, it unlocks a lot of the funds from CTIO, who operate a lot of our express lanes on the interstates, allows them to use some funds for non-highway investments, which is very cool. And also requires really requires FRPR and RTD and CDOT, all these entities to work together to get that Northwest Rail line finished as soon as possible. And the state's throwing in money to get it done. And FRPR is really leading the charge on a lot of these study efforts. But it's, these are general statutory obligations to a certain extent, and we'll have to see sort of what is the final agreement that FRPR and RTD come to on this. A bunch of other cool transit changes. So there's going to be a statewide free fare for better air or free fare for youth program. Unfortunately, a single transit agency can't claim both of those funds from the state for fiscal reasons. There's going to be an exploratory committee for a statewide transit pass. So hopefully one day you can, hop on RTD up here, take a bus to Union Station, hop on Front Range Passenger Rail, head down to the Springs and get on a Mountain Metro bus, all with a single ticket. But that's way out. That's really technically complicated, and they got to figure it out first. Some big tax credits for businesses to buy transit passes for their employees. Another provision is that RTD can now dispose of property for less than fair market value, which is huge for a lot of these park and rides that are sitting empty across the metro area. As you can think, combined with this TOC bill and this parking bill, and all the affordable housing tax credits, essentially a lot of these RTD lots that right now are just empty concrete can hopefully turn into thriving communities, which I'm very excited about. There's some RTD transparency requirements in Senate Bill 230, some like publicly facing dashboards, which I've heard RTD has already been working on. So looking forward to when those are published. The state's getting a strengthened negotiating position on Moffat Tunnel. The lease on that tunnel from the freight railroads is up. So, and there was a really hostile statute from the time of the Moffat Tunnel's construction, and that got fixed this session, which is great. There's some good financial assistance for the communities up in the Yampa Valley region, I believe, and a new Office of Railroad Safety for freight rail, which is an exciting development as well. And finally, on to the last topic, which is active transportation and safety. This bill, I gotta admit, some of this stuff took a little bit of a back seat to the transit and land use discussion. There was a lot more work on this last year due to the e-bike programs that the state introduced, but there's still some developments. So massive shout out to Bicycle Colorado for leading the charge on the hands-free driving bill, Senate Bill 65. It will make using a phone while driving a primary offense, a classic traffic infraction. It'll be uniform across all ages. That's expanding from just being illegal right now for people under the age of 18. It closes a loophole in current law as well. And with this law now going to be on the books, I've heard the governor's going to sign it. Colorado will now be a hands-free state. We've got really good data that these laws actually do reduce the amount of distracted driving by a significant amount. So there will be a statewide education campaign to tell people about this change in the law and to tell folks that, hey, using your phone while driving, texting while driving, watching a video while you're driving, or otherwise being distracted on it, is not acceptable anymore. This is also huge because this bill has been run and has died every single year for the past 6 or 7 years. This is the first time it made it through. And that's, massive credit. This one was an 11th hour. It got amended a lot at the 11th hour and actually came out really, really good. So really some excellent work on this one. Next up, the Vulnerable Road User Bill, Senate Bill 195. This bill started out as an enterprise fund that charged registration fees for cars. That went up the heavier a car was. That proved unpopular with one particular senator. And so that bill died, and they brought back a different version of the bill that kind of does similar things, but we lost the registration fee. However, what this does do, and I saw Director Ford's on the agenda for later, so this bill actually clears the way for photo enforcement on the entire high injury network in Denver. There's this bill sets out a lot of procedural stuff regarding photo enforcement implementation on state highways. And it really ironed it out, and it essentially gave us a timeout period before the rules go into effect between now and January 1st. So basically, Denver can, of its own volition, approve photo enforcement cameras on every single state highway in our city. So that's huge for our safety goals. I'm very, very happy that made it into the bill. Also, for the first time ever in state history, CDOT has to set declining fatality and SBI targets. I tried to make that stronger than it was, but originally was just fatality targets, but I got SBI targets added to it. I don't have a specific target. I tried to get a specific target and I wasn't able to get that amendment. But this, I believe, is still stronger than the federal standard that Departments of Transportation have had to follow for the past 3 years. So it is in the right direction. And finally, this bill reallocates $7 million from highway safety projects annually to ped and bike projects on our state highway system. So not a huge dollar amount. Quite frankly, it's pretty disappointing where the funding piece landed on this bill, but there's still a lot of good stuff in this one, and it's still moving in the right direction. And I posted a picture here of the Spear Boulevard and 23rd Avenue bridges. I think the conversation I'm seeing around those is showing a serious culture change within CDOT, moving away from level service and more towards traffic safety. Some other miscellaneous things that I didn't cover, just didn't fit into other sections. There's a new bill that increased educational requirements for minors seeking driver's licenses and permits. That sailed through pretty easily. There's some changes in other motor vehicle offenses, but that happens every session. Nothing that I thought was worth highlighting. And then finally, there was a big transit reform bill that you might have heard of, House Bill 1447. It died after significant community opposition, but I counted 3 provisions from that bill that were dropped into other bills, all of which I'm okay with. So, okay, great. So thank you all so much for listening. I know that was a fire hose of information, and I cannot see chat or questions right now since I'm just staring at my presentation. But I'm happy to take questions, to talk about the process, to talk about these bills in more depth, and to overall answer some concerns and stuff from folks.
Thanks. And we do have a little more time. I just got texted from Amy Ford. Her son is being presented with an award at the end of the school year here, and she is in the audience waiting for his name to be called before she joins with us. So we have a little bit of time here. So
All right.
questions. We did have a question from Bruce about if there's any provisions for overriding existing regulations or agreements. Bruce, do you want to ask the question in your words?
Yeah, I'm just real curious how that what's the transit oriented construction would work butting up against a multi-decade view plane combined with an agreement with an R&O for 50 years.
Yeah, so
if you don't know, this is at Southmore Light Rail Station.
Yeah, so Southmore was one I actually looked at a bit closely because I was like, well, there's that retaining wall right between the community on the western side of the tracks versus the big parking lot on the eastern side.
That's another problem.
Yeah, so I looked at that specifically. There's actually in the bill. There shouldn't be any change, I believe, to the zoning on the west side of the tracks there, past the retaining wall, because of one of the exemptions that was like, hey, if it's not actually within walking distance of a train station because there's a separation, like a physical barrier separation, then there shouldn't be an effect. I will say broadly, state law in this case, I believe would override local law on this. However, there is also a lot of flexibility in this TOC bill. So if city council, if the city of Denver takes a look at it and is like, you know what, some of the South, we're not going to concentrate density around Southmore. We want to concentrate it around Broadway, for example. They could do that and essentially just directly shift from one area to the other. What just matters overall is that our total zoning capacity in all those transit-oriented areas has to be 40 units per acre on average. So one can have a lot higher density and one can have a lot lower density. It's kind of up to the municipalities to figure out how to balance that.
That seems like a clear thing an important thing to clarify, because the illustration that you made around DU was not saying all these areas will be upzoned. You're saying that's the area the calculation is based on, and it's up to the city to decide which of those areas are zoned, however they're zoned, such that the average is 40 units per acre.
Yeah, so that's how it works, is that those zones are for the calculations and where zoning changes could occur, not where they will occur, where they could occur. And also it's a question of zoning capacity. So it's not like saying it's like you got to build, 50,000 more units. It's saying, no, you need to zone for that many more units. And then, sort of it's up to the market and affordable housing developers and other folks to figure out if they actually want to take advantage of that zoning capacity. So it's honestly a very flexible standard, and the city can put zoning capacity where it makes most sense, and not necessarily just uniform. It's got to be this much everywhere, right? Also, like the exemptions really make sense. Digging into it, there's a lot of good stuff in there.
There's a developer who does not own anything around Southmore that's got a proposal pending for CPD to redevelop the theater that died there. But again, the R&O gets to vote on, they have to approve what goes in there.
Yeah,
I'm not going to speak to the specifics of that agreement since I don't actually know that agreement. I know there are other questions to get to, but this is really something I'd encourage you talking to your city council person about. There's a pretty significant on-ramp for the TOC bill of a few years, because it's honestly pretty complicated to implement. So I'd really encourage you to reach out to your city council folks and get some clarification.
Yeah, just to finish with the land use, the one thing this does change in terms of zoning directly is allowing ADUs everywhere, which Denver was on the path to get to. They were on that path for a long time. The state finally got us to that goal. So that's the one thing that does change. And there's still an implementation time frame for that.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say, I think touches every single resident of our city from these bills really is that ADU bill, because it just says you can build an ADU by right. It's just something you can do if you want to. And that'll be in effect by June 30th of next year. Same thing with the parking bill.
Great. Amy's got a question about participating at this state level. Amy?
My family's making me laugh in the background. June, you are such an inspiration, and I would like to know, how can everyday people get more involved at the state level? Is it true that you can just show up and sign up and testify, or how does it work?
Yeah, so I'll say there's sort of two ways to get involved in this. There's both during session and out of session. So since we're in the interim, I'm going to give you the most timely advice, which is to wait like 2 weeks and then email your state representatives or senators. If there's an issue in your neighborhood or something you really deeply care about, try to find some time and sit down and have coffee with them, or talk to them about your priorities and what issues you really hold dear. These state elected officials are genuinely a lot more approachable and reachable than our federal level officials. So I'd encourage you to go talk to them and literally just introduce yourself, build a relationship. There's a lot of good people out there doing good work. During session, it's the people's house. You can show up to the state capitol. I will say just up front, the state legislative process, there's a reason that lobbyists are paid good money to do it. It's because it is complicated. It is often inaccessible. It's often very opaque from an outsider perspective. Where we do get public input, though, that the average person can do, you don't need experience to do it, is find bills you're interested in and just keep an eye on when their committee dates are, sign up to testify, and just give the committee your 3 minutes and tell them what you think. Testimony really does make a difference. Good, coherent testimony that really ties it back to a personal level and is based in personal experience and expertise does genuinely make a difference. I have flipped votes with testimony before. So it is totally something that's doable. Yeah, testify and go talk to your elected officials. Genuinely, that is the best way to get involved. And also get involved in organizations that do this work and have people who are paid to do it, because they're going to be the ones who know exactly where to push and when and where to get amendments done.
I think we're hearing a lot this year, of course, from Bicycle Colorado, Denver Streets Partnership, and then the two advocacy orgs that June's affiliated with, Denver Bicycle Lobby and Greater Denver Transit. Any of those who are following bills can give you a hint as to this would be a good committee to show up to. They need some testimony here. So it is an incredibly opaque process, and I would have no idea myself how or when to show up if it wasn't for these other groups following it. And so being in touch with them is very good.
Yeah, and I will say on myself, I was a legislative aide for over a year. So that's why I know so much about the process and where to get involved and how. So it is not very accessible for the average citizen. That's why it's important to get involved in groups and to just build that relationship with that elected official yourself in the interim when there aren't all these bills going through the process. They're there to represent you. So tell them what you want.
As I mentioned, we do have a little more time because Amy Ford is awaiting her son's award presentation. So one of the questions I had was, June, can you tell us more about what this enables for automated enforcement? And this kind of shades into what I hope Amy Ford will talk about is we know that to get people to behave in safe ways on our streets, you have to design the streets in a way that reinforces the behavior you want. And yet, to meet the urgency of the moment, we might need to couple that with automated enforcement because it's going to take quite a while to redesign the street. So what latitude does this bill give a local municipality on the applicable roads for automated enforcement? Is it just red light cameras? Could it be speed cameras? What all could be involved?
Yeah, so there's really two bills that are important to this discussion. SB 23200 from last year, which broadly allowed automated enforcement pretty much everywhere in our urban areas, and SB 24195 this year, which sort of changed some of the rules and how to implement them on state highways. So broadly speaking, the kinds of photo enforcement that are allowed are speed cameras, red light cameras, bus lane enforcement cameras, bike lane cameras. Basically, if there's a traffic infraction associated with the behavior, then state law sort of allows municipalities to choose what technology they want to use. So broadly, what the bill last year and this year have done is make it so that with evidence, cities can't just install these cameras just because they want to. They need to have evidence. But it allows cities to put photo enforcement cameras in the most dangerous areas, and not just on locally owned roads, but also on state-owned highways that the city maintains. So for Denver, that's pretty much every state highway in the city because CDOT doesn't actually take care of their roads in our community. We do. So from what I know, what this broadly allows us to do, and I know Director Ford is going to talk more about this, but we're really looking at speed cameras, especially in Denver, because those have the best safety effects overall. So,
okay.
That's sort of, and also I did get an amendment in there in 195 to allow bus lane enforcement cameras because they just generally keep the bus lanes clear. They're less about safety and more about operational efficiency. So I got an amendment in 195 to make those easier to do as well. So basically any camera that we find to be useful, and we've got some flexibility before next year to sort of do all the legal stuff, and then we can phase in implementation as needed.
Those bus lane cameras sound like great ideas because sometimes a dedicated bus lane is very clearly dedicated and you wouldn't use it for anything else, like what's going in on East Colfax. Other times they're sort of, you wonder if people really are going to treat them as dedicated when we need them to be dedicated in order to keep transit flowing.
Yeah.
Stan has a similar question here, picking up on this topic. Stan?
Hey, June, great job on all the work you've done. I'm going to pose a question that you've heard before, but I want the audience to hear it. And that is, no matter how successful we are at designing streets, how much legislation we can implement, there are still those drivers we know that exhibit poor or bad driving habits. There's no real legislation on that, but any thoughts or how can we get folks to think about that, along with legislation that's implemented, better designed streets, and, you know, many other things. Your thoughts, June, and
Yeah.
you've heard it from me before, but let's get it out in the community.
Yeah, so my thinking on this is that, so first of all, we know that majority of drivers, the vast majority of drivers do listen to a lot of these things. And this is relevant to this question because bad drivers aren't just surrounded by other bad drivers. They're surrounded in many cases by good, reasonable, safe people. So essentially, you know, if a person who's a habitual speeder is penned in on all sides by people who are driving at the safe speed, that habitual speeder, if they want to speed, would just crash, and they'd have to deal with the consequences of that crash on themselves. They're not going to do it. So essentially, when you increase traffic safety compliance in the general population, it tends to hem in those bad behaviors from individual actors. So there's a certain amount of group compliance enforced on people who otherwise would pay no attention. You know, in terms of design, we'd prefer street designs to be self-enforcing, but there will always be drivers who just don't pay attention to all the cues around them. So that's when punitive measures, like, for example, getting a ticket from a camera, that's when a punitive measure like that can actually work. Because it's no longer just they're ignoring all the cues around them, they're getting a direct penalty. And we've got really good data from a lot of these camera systems that does happen. But what about those people who, you know, get like 60 speeding tickets a year and are constantly aggressive and weaving in and out of traffic and just being horrible? To a certain extent, there's not a whole lot you can do about those people. You can do your best to work with the surrounding population, but ultimately, in my opinion, the best way to make sure that those people aren't being horrible, aggressive drivers and disrupting everyone's day is to make it so that fewer people have to drive and just don't have to deal with them in the first place. So, or that those aggressive drivers are no longer in control of a vehicle. So more walkable communities, more active transportation, more transit options, and just, you know, at a certain point after they get like 50 speeding tickets, they just get fed up. And, you know, I will say those rogue actors do exist, but I think we've got enough controls throughout the systems that we can effectively mitigate the negative consequences of their behavior. With the tools that we have. I hope that makes sense.
It's a challenge to address. I've reached out to Pete at Bicycle Colorado and even AAA to get their thoughts, and it's just an ongoing discussion. I've reached out to Amy Ford, so it's just something I want folks to be aware of. The more people I talk to, the more I hear they have similar thoughts too, and they get frustrated with the road rage and the poor driving. And I guess eventually they'll get their license taken away if that's the bottom line, but we don't want that to happen. But
at a certain point, if someone's being a danger to themselves and others on the road and their behavior isn't changing, they shouldn't drive. At a certain point. They're a danger to society and we shouldn't allow that.
All right.
Can I chime in with an analogy, Stan?
Sure.
I'm thinking like back in the olden days when everyone smoked inside, and then we gradually made it, there was a smoking section and you could look down on the people in the smoking section. And then gradually those people are outside in the winter, huddling around, smoking by the door. And now, you know, there's just not that many smokers anymore because it's just society has like shamed people out of smoking. So I think maybe instead of making it super cool to go super fast in a super fast car, if we can societally shame them out of it, plus, you know, the infrastructure and everything, and eventually, of course, they'll die.
Well, certainly the street design, we know that people are reacting to how fast it feels like you should go based on the street design. So the faster we can iterate on that, which is, there's some really good news in our first presentation about redesigning some of our major corridors, and keep iterating on that. It's not all about enforcement, as I like what June said. Good design is self-enforcing. Let's get to a couple bigger picture questions. James had a a big picture question.
All right. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
Beautiful. Well, June, I first want to extend my congratulations and thanks to you for all the terrific amount of work that you've done over the last 3 months in particular. I want to, as we kind of like look to the future, what do you feel like you've learned about, excuse me, what do you feel like you've learned about this process where we can kind of keep the momentum going with the legislators who are thinking about transit, who are thinking about land use, who are thinking about housing? How do we kind of move forward from here, build on the momentum, and keep the focus on these topics?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. I think top of mind for me immediately is just the elections that are upcoming. Those House and Senate races really do make a massive difference. I know a lot of the most anti-land use changes legislators are actually moving on from the General Assembly. So making sure that basically whoever is elected is sort of pro a lot of these urbanist ideas, I think is a really big part of it, because they're the ones in the room making the decisions, right? They're the ones empowered to vote. Also, building this local community momentum is huge. You know, if Denver as a city, like if our city council mayor didn't come out in support of 1313 and 1304, it's maybe not likely that those bills would have passed. And that emerges directly from local activism that was done in those elections, right? And in the previous years. So genuinely, the way to keep that momentum going is just to keep on trucking, is to keep iterating on good ideas and keep building coalitions and keep building relationships and to come up with good ideas and to stakehold them and build partnerships. Genuinely, if you want to keep that stuff going, that's how you do it. And I've got midterm and long-term answers on how to do some of that more, but that's how to do it. Coalition building, keep on doing this local work, keeping engaged in your neighborhoods and your communities and pushing for changes you want. That's how to do it.
So I guess just super quick then, are there like just 2 or 3 things that got cut from one of these bills, or one of these or 2 or 3 ideas that were kind of close but didn't quite make it, that you think we should continue to push on? Do you have kind of 2 or 3 examples of stuff you'd like to, keep the coalitions churning and burning on?
Yeah, so commercial parking minimums were something that weren't touched this session that I think are very much need to be looked at. So that's number 1. I think number 2 is active transportation infrastructure. That's something that sort of took a backseat this session. But as we take a look at all these transit-oriented communities and all the new density and infill that we're trying to do in a lot of places around the state, and also at our continual transportation budget shortfalls that we still have despite all the faster money and despite all the Senate Bill 260 money from a few years back. Active transportation infrastructure like sidewalks and bike lanes are going to be really important for allowing communities to grow without facing the serious congestion problems that can honestly cause a lot of air quality issues and time issues and just general annoyance. So that'd be my answer: commercial parking minimums and active transportation infrastructure.
Thomas has a question about the state legislature.
So June, you did an amazing, awesome amount of work. We really appreciate all that you did. I don't think most people realize how effective you were in actually making legislation more effective. So that's a huge outcome for you. So thank you. We just went through 4 months of the most intense process and part of being a legislator. What happens between now and next January session? And I was just realizing this is an election year, so most is everybody up for re-election in the legislature? I've always been confused by that. But what usually happens between now and the next legislation?
This is a great question. So everyone in the House is up for re-election. Half the Senate is up for re-election. What they actually do sort of depends on the person. A lot of them are going to be campaigning. So that's genuinely, even year interim, they're going to be campaigning for most of them. Even the ones who aren't in a campaign themselves are going to be campaigning for their colleagues. So that's a big part of what they're going to be doing. A lot of these folks have other jobs that they do. So they'll be heading back to whatever else they do for the interim. They do a bunch of constituent meetings. This is also the time where they develop legislation, and that tends to pick up sort of towards the end of the interim, not sort of maybe towards the beginning. So legislation development, working with their local communities, campaigning, sleeping for a whole month now that session is over, going on vacations, just normal stuff relatively. So that's what they do between now and next session. They do a decent amount of stuff, but it's definitely, I would say, less hectic than session. And it should be less hectic. These poor people have been working 16-hour days for 6 days a week in some cases.
Right. So is this a good, obviously give them a break for the rest of the month, but is this a good time during the summer to contact them about where they want to continue to work on stuff? I mean, obviously if they're doing the campaigning, they're going to be talking about it, but they're always also going to be focused on spreading the message instead of perhaps as drilling down so much on individual conversations.
Yeah, it also depends on the legislator. For a lot of these folks in safe seats who aren't facing primary challenges, they don't have to worry about the election as much. Yeah, I would say midsummer is when a lot of these folks are going to be alive again, and will actually be able to pay attention to things. So yeah, give them the month of May off, I would say, but then, schedule some meetings in June or July or August and sit down with your elected officials and talk to them about issues and sort of see what interest areas they have. And if you've got specific topics, Joel has my contact info. I encourage you to reach out to Joel, and we can connect about maybe what interests you, and I can connect you with someone who's working on it. Yeah, Bruce, that's a great point. The interim does include interim committee meetings. So, for example, relevant for this group is the Transportation Legislation Review Committee. They meet between 3 and 5 times every interim. So they meet sort of late summer, fall, winter time period. So, there'll be those interim committees going on. Yeah, I would say I hope that broadly answers the question about what are they doing, when to get in contact. Get in contact with them after May. Give them a few weeks. But after May, feel free to reach out to them and start talking about new legislation. Yeah, JBC meets year round, Bruce. Their schedule is wild.
Well, great. One of the things that I've been impressed with the past few years is sort of I'm on the outside looking in at CDOT, but used to think of them as the highway department, and through a number of steps here, including Senate Bill 260, they've really changed in character, tone, goals. We know about prior ideas for highway widening that are not only not being pursued, but they're actually taking steps that would preclude them from pursuing them, which that's pretty definitive. Some of these bills this year had to do with CDOT. Either they're involved in it or they have to do with regulating their facilities. Did you have any impressions from working up close and personal with their folks?
I did. So I worked pretty closely with Emily Hadway, who's their legislative liaison. I spent a lot of time talking to John Putnam, who's one of their general counsel. And I mean, I spent a bit of time talking to San Lee, who's one of their state traffic engineers. So I spent a good amount of time talking with CDOT. I could tell you, so one of the provisions that got into a bill this year was about Burnham Yards. And specifically, what that provision essentially told us was that CDOT no longer is even planning to expand I-25. They don't want to move the rail tracks away from I-25 to expand I-25 anymore. They just don't care about it. The fact that a lot of these bills that are CDOT supported this year, pretty much every single one that put new money into CDOT was all about passenger rail and transit. like busting expansions, Front Range Passenger Rail, Northern Rocky Mountain Rail. That's all transit stuff, right? We saw reallocation of highway funds even, like in the new VRU bill. It wasn't a huge amount, but they literally pulled away money that was traditionally used for highway safety projects. So, and a lot of those funds were previously used for widenings, of course, under the guise of safety, but still widenings. So there's really that sense of cultural change that I felt where the priorities are just different than they used to be. I've seen it in legislative text, in the tone of their representatives. They're not quite where I want them to be. But really, yeah, the tone has changed. And the fact that not only has the tone changed, but we're seeing legislation to really shift CDOT's focus is, I mean, it's a natural continuation from the greenhouse gas planning standard from a few years back. So yeah, it's moving in the right direction from what I can tell. Not quite there yet, but it is the right direction.
That's great. It seemed like so much of the controversy this year wasn't really about the things. It was about conceptual topics like local control, like who gets to decide, not whether something is a good idea or not, but who gets to decide, which is different than people fighting about whether something is a good idea or not.
Yeah, I will say
And that's not CDOT I'm talking about, but many, local cities throughout the
Yeah,
state.
the local control conversation was really top of mind for everyone last year with the land use bill, but I saw those talking points show up a lot less this year. I think also part of it is that there was a lot of really serious classism that showed up in a lot of these land use conversations last year, and a lot of local governments saw that, and I think have started to distance themselves from it. And if they've realized that the state is going in this direction of land use, that, you know what, they'll provide assistance and they'll sort of run with it. Not everyone's happy with all the land use stuff that's going on, but the local control conversation, that the temperature around that, I think, decreased this year compared to last year, even though more got done. Maybe it's because the temperature decreased that more did get done.
That's great. This is such a great perspective. Thank you so much, June, for all the work you put in and the perspective and connecting, what I think of as neighbors, whether somebody identifies first and foremost with their neighborhood organization or with their favorite advocacy group. We're not the big money folks who have the paid lobbyists because we have moneyed interests or a business improvement district or an industry group. We're neighbors wanting to make our streets safer. And thank you for not only representing, but also interpreting for us.
Yeah, that's something that I found to be really important. I was in the building last year and I was like, wow, every single person really dictating these policy decisions is either an elected official or a lobbyist representing someone who has money. And quite frankly, the representatives often do their best, but if they're not hearing from the people, they won't necessarily make decisions well informed by the people. So that was what I wanted to do, is I wanted to show up as someone who's car free, as someone who really cares about all this, sustainable transportation and climate change, and comes from this local community activism background, and give them that voice and that perspective, because it's one they don't hear often, especially one who's a lobbyist. I wasn't accepting payment for my services. I'm still not accepting payment for my services. I'm still trying to get a job, but ultimately, I wanted our communities to have a voice in the room, and also, maybe more importantly, not just have a voice in the room, but be able to know what's actually going on in the room. So thank you so much for inviting me here to share that and let people know sort of what's been going on under that golden dome.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. We're gonna wrap up here. Let me tell you a little bit about what happened with Amy Ford. First of all, the mayor sent out an announcement that there was going to be an announcement. He set a time and a place on new action on Vision Zero. Really trying to drive down deaths and serious injuries on our roads, and that got rescheduled. But prior to being rescheduled, I jumped on Amy Ford's calendar and said, would you come to this meeting and talk to us about what tactics from the playbook. If you haven't seen the Denver's Vision Zero action plan, the new 2.0 version, it's a big playbook of a lot of tactics. Which ones are you going to accelerate to make a big impact soon and basically save a lot of people's lives. And she agreed immediately, and then quickly let me know that even though the mayor had to reschedule that meeting, she was still planning to come. And then it was just on the last day that she found out that her son was winning an award at high school, and of course needed to be there for that. So she's been checking in by text. You never know with these awards things when your person is going to get called, but unfortunately that ran out of time. So we will invite her back because we want to go deep into what actions we'll see on the roads to make them safer, hopefully very design related. And if there is automated enforcement that Denver starts doing now that Denver's more allowed to than ever before, that's, in my opinion, a stopgap while roads are redesigned. But we'll, I haven't heard what the palette of things are they're going to accelerate. And my dearest hope is that the mayor uses his moral authority, the way he brought to House 1000 to say, we are going to do this because it's going to save lives for, a very different topic, but for essentially the same reasons, because it's the right thing to do, to save lives. So we will reschedule Amy Ford and wish you all a good night.